What's up, duelists? November 2022 Edison tier list. I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently than the previous tier list. I'm going to be showing you guys a deck list and then rating that deck on the tier list video, so that way you guys are getting to see exactly what the deck is that I'm talking about. But first things first, before we get into the tier list, if you guys aren't already subscribed, I really want to hit 10K by the end of the year, and I know it's totally possible. Honestly, if all the people watching right now who are unsubscribed subscribe right now, I hit 10K, that's how it goes. And you guys are going to like the content. You are going to like, I mean, you're here for Edison, right? You're here for the alt format stuff. You're here for the based dueling. You're here for the community. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Let's go ahead and get right into this tier list. Okay, first deck list I got pulled up is the Kuras Carpath Field Spell Control deck. For those of you guys who don't know this deck, the way it works is you try to take over the game using large monsters, either Ancient Gear Gadgetron Dragon, Titanial, Ancient Fairy Dragon from the extra deck, or Kuras the Light Monarch. All of these monsters are very powerful, and they have synergy with the card Gear Town. You can use Gear Town in Edison format thanks to the way it's ruled. Okay, it's not going to show up. Thanks to the way it's ruled, to set a field spell over your own Gear Town, it will be destroyed by game mechanic in Edison format, and you'll be able to summon an Ancient Gear Dragon from your hand, deck, or graveyard. So you get fast monsters, fast pressure, and then you have backup engine of going debris into Ancient Fairy, popping your own Gear Town. If you choose not to search, then the Gear Town won't miss timing, and you can special summon out an Ancient Gear Dragon. So the deck is pretty powerful. It has a lot of really cool synergies. It has draw power in the Kuras. It has tutor power in the Sangan. It has the best defensive tools in Gore's Tragodia and Triple Wind Blast. You get to maximize off of Mind Control and Brain Control, which are two of the most powerful spells in the format. And Heavy Storm is, of course, an OTK combo enabler in every sense of the word in this deck. So I think this is a pretty strong deck. I think it has some trouble with some of the other decks we'll talk about later, but for the most part, I'd probably put this deck moving forward into B tier. Strong deck, strong deck. If you want to play a really creative deck that has a lot of fun combo lines, I'd recommend this deck. I think it's a blast. Very, very fun deck to play. Okay, next deck. Next deck. We've got Telekinetic Zombies. Telekinetic Teledad. The way this deck works is it's a synchro combo deck. Later in the game, you get Telekinetic Powerwell, which is a virtual soul charge to special summon out upwards of 3 Krebins from your graveyard to go for big synchro plays. You also have access to a small zombie engine. You get to play the best of the best zombie cards. You're not worried about, your Pyramid Turtle getting destroyed by battle, or like trying to set up weird Spirit Reaper like defensive things in some matchups where that's maybe not the best. And then you do get to play all the powerful hero stuff in Stratos Malicious, and you get to maximize off of Armageddonite and Dark Grepher, which are cards that are, as you probably know, limited in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of their power level, to set up your Krebins in the graveyard. This is probably one of the best decks in the format. I think this takes the cake in terms of like 6-star Synchro Spam, Dark Arm Synchro Spam deck. It is probably one of the most fun Synchro Spam decks to play. Your deck pretty much just like feeds into itself. Krebins is a really nice card to make sure you don't get run over by aggro decks, and it's also a really nice card to poke at opposing Raikos or play into destruction effects like Torrential or Mirror Force, because later in the game they are pretty much coming back for free off the Telekinetic Powerwell. So where I'd rank this deck is I actually think this deck is an S tier deck. I think it's one of the best decks in the format. I think Dark Armed is probably one of the best monsters in the format, and this is one of the best decks at abusing the best synchro in the format, which is Bryonic Dragon, the Ice Barrier. We'll reposition the S tier as it gets more cluttered, and the other tiers as it gets more cluttered. But for now, this deck is definitely going in S tier. Big fan of this deck. Big fan of this deck. I also got to shout out one of the viewers, Control Alt Defeat. He put me onto this strategy, and ever since he did, I've been playing it a shit ton. It is so much fun. Also, one of the coolest decks to play Doom Caliber Knight in as well. Okay, next deck. The next deck we've got is Ancient Gear Machina. This is probably one of the scariest decks in the format if Cyber Dragon didn't exist. The way this deck works is, again, you try to utilize Gear Town and the ruling mechanic in Edison format to special summon out multiple Ancient Gear monsters, and then you can also pitch them later if they are drawn to Monster Reborn, your Machina Fortress, which is one of the best boss monsters, if not the best boss monster in the format. The issue with this deck is everyone and their mom is citing Cyber Dragon. So if you summon a couple of machine monsters, your opponent will summon a Cyber Dragon, and they'll be able to fusion with their Cyber Dragon and your machine monsters to make a Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon. And this is oftentimes a blowout in which you cannot come back from. If you play through one Cyber Dragon, then you have a God Hand. If your opponent has 2 Cyber Dragons, it's usually just lights out. It's very difficult for these machine-only decks to play through Cyber Dragon, and it's really tough because you have to be able to go for these OTKs, go for these pushes, and account for that. That being said, game one, if your opponent's not main decking Cyber Dragon, it is probably one of the best game one decks in the format. It's one of the fastest decks. It has a lot of interesting, unique interactions. Ancient Gear Beast is good against the glut of recruiters and Raikos that this format is packed full of. And Machina Fortress also plays very well into Raiko and Caius, which are the two most popular monsters in the format. So game one, the deck is insane. Game one is probably the best deck in the format. Game 2 and 3, it gets a lot worse. It gets a lot worse. And then because of that, I think I have to put the deck, sadly, I have to put the deck in B tier. I have to put the deck in B tier. I think it is a little bit better. I think it is a little bit better than the Carpath deck, even though the Carpath deck is more unique and more fun. I think Ancient Gear is like doing the same thing, but it's a little bit more streamlined. However, I do think because of the omnipresence is the word I'm looking for, of Cyber Dragon, it makes game 2 and 3 very, very difficult for this deck. If your opponent draws Cyber Dragon in game 2 or 3, it pretty much means we're going to the next game unless you have one of your mini outs in the sideboard, including, but not limited to, Thunder King, Bottomless Trap Hole, that kind of thing. Okay, next deck. Next deck. We've got Diva Zombies. So Diva Zombies is one of these decks where my opinion on it and the actual results of the deck are quite different. I think that this deck is an objectively worse version of the Telekinetic deck. I think the Telekinetic deck just does what this deck does, but better. You're not limited to normal summoning Diva to make a power play. You aren't limited to playing a 200-400 monster that's just very weak. Krebens is an actual card if you draw it. And then, of course, you're not stuck on like 15 different normal summons with all of these different recruiters. Instead, you've got Grepher into Telekinetic so you can make quicker plays in the middle to late game. I think that this deck is one of the most powerful decks in the format, and it has a lot of good matchups against the other high-tier decks, with a few exceptions, of course. But I do think it's a little bit clunkier of a deck than the Telekinetic deck personally. So where I would rate it is, strangely enough, I think I would put it in the S tier. I think it is good enough to be an S tier deck because it is just better than everything below it. But I think it is kind of an objectively worse version of the Telekinetic deck. I think it has a lot going for it and it has the results to back it up, but I think it is just a worse version of the Telekinetic deck personally. So that's where I'm going to rank it for this tier list. It is a very strong deck. The combos are very similar to that of the Telekinetic deck. You have Dark Arm Dragon. You also do get to play Future Fusion, which is cool. Future Fusion can send Mizuki, and it can also send Malicious from the deck to the grave. So it acts as kind of a second copy of Foolish Burial. But, you know, you kind of have that sort of strength in the Telekinetic deck built into the engine with Armageddon and Grepher. So it's a little bit clunkier. And I've also found Pyramid Turtle to be a pretty underwhelming card in general. So, strong deck, and it definitely has the results to back it up. A lot of top 8s, a lot of wins, especially in the last weekend at Pasadena. I think Diva Zombies was the deck that won the most side events from all of the data that I've compiled. So it is a very powerful deck. It's definitely an S tier deck, but it's in my opinion a little bit worse than the Telekinetic deck. Okay, moving on. Next deck. We've got Fish OTK. At the beginning of 2021, when Edison format was being revisited for the first time by a lot of competitive players, people were saying that the Fish OTK deck was the best deck in the format. And it was beating up on a lot of the newer players, and people weren't really adapting their lists to deal with it. As the format progressed, as we've got more and more powerful decks in the format, as the decks have gotten faster, as the aggression has gotten more ridiculous, as more decks are citing extreme sideboard cards like Fossil Dyna, Vanity's Fiend, that kind of stuff, this deck has definitely felt a lot weaker. It also suffers in the fact that if you don't draw Coelacanth, your deck actually does nothing. It's very, very difficult to win a game through like any sort of interaction without Coelacanth. You can make some like mid-ground synchro plays thanks to your tuners and your Fishborg Blaster nonsense, but you're often doing it at card disadvantage, and it's pretty difficult to put together a win if you don't find Coelacanth. So where I'm going to rate this deck is actually in the C tier. I think the metagame is a little bit too hostile towards it. This deck going into something like Diva Zombie or Telekinetic Zombie in any capacity, I feel like you're just unfavored. They're doing more proactive stuff than you. They also have access to powerful bombs like Dark Armed. They Caius your starter, all of a sudden you're suffering. They Book of Life your Treeborn, all of a sudden you're suffering. And I think it's just, in general, doing what a lot of other decks can do, but doing it slower and relying on one card to do it. The combo itself is pretty complex, and it has a bunch of different routes. Where's that deck list? Okay, here we are. I should probably just close these deck lists when I'm done with them. That's what I'm going to do. Actually, you know what? That's a great idea. I'm doing that. Okay. The combo itself has a lot of different routes, and it lets you win from a lot of different positions, but the issue is executing the combo takes so many cards. You need Deep Sea King Coelacanth, so that's 1 card. You need 2 cards to tribute for it, so that's 3 cards. You need a sweeper for the back row, so that's 4 cards. You need a card to discard for Coelacanth, so that's 5 cards. And then you need a card to discard for Fishborg Blaster if you need to extend past the initial combo, which is 6 cards. So it's a 6-card combo. While most of those cards are not like super generic, or they are pretty generic, and you can oftentimes, you know, do them for free, like Treeborn Frog or whatever, Battle Fader, Gores, that kind of thing. It's still a 6-card combo, and if you interrupt any one of those 6 pieces of the combo, then the combo is just not going off, and the deck is just not resolving. So it's just a little bit too fragile when analyzed under a more modern lens on the format. Still a cool deck, still a very powerful deck, still something that you guys should respect and consider when building your deck for a tournament or whatnot. And I think it has potential to win like at a local level or whatever, but I don't see this deck ever really doing much at a major level. Okay, next deck. We've got Flamvell. Oh, and this is a special list. This is a very special list. This is my personal Flamvell Lightsworn list. This is a list that I have played in a members-only video. If you want to support the channel, it's $2.99 a month to support the channel. Be a member. You get access to emotes. You get access to weekly exclusive content. You get access to a lot of cool deck lists, some of which I'll be showing in this tier list video. And yeah, pretty much it's just a cool way to support the channel. All the membership fees go towards helping pay for the tournament bot and the Discord, pay for the tournament prize pools, that kind of stuff. So it goes towards supporting everything if you guys want to support the community and see me play deck lists like this. This is a cool take on the Flamvell list that I've been practicing with quite a bit. The way this deck works is you want to summon a Lila and then back it up with either a trap card or an Honest. It makes it very difficult for your opponent to pressure you to break through that kind of board. And they also can't set back row to interact with you very favorably that way either. Once you have Lila in play for a turn or two, you get to mill a couple of cards. And then you either mill some Magicians, some Fire Dogs, or you mill a Rekindling, which you can get back with Magical Stone Excavation. And then you can set up for a big turn. Phantom Skyblaster is the big tech that I've been working on in Flamvell for a while. The way it works is sometimes you have Rekindling with 2 Magicians, and you can't really do too much. Rekindling with 2 Magicians and 1 Phantom Skyblaster gets you 2 level 8s for 2 cards, which is actually very high value. I think that's the closest thing you can get to 2 level 8s. Actually, I think you also get a token as well. It's a +1. It's a +1 combo, basically. You're Rekindling for 2 Magicians, you summon the Skyblaster, you get 2 tokens, and then you can sync run to 2 level 8s, and then you either get to keep a token or you get to keep the Skyblaster itself. So it's a pretty good combo. And then Magical Stone Excavation is just so you have a 4th copy of Rekindling. It can also help you set up for Rekindling by pitching drawn Flamvell Magicians or drawn Flamvell Fire Dogs. I think this deck, overall, as a whole, is a very good deck. This list specifically. I think there are a lot of lists of Flamvell that are weaker decks. I think they don't have the same sort of push and OTK potential, but I think specifically that list with the Lila opening and the Skyblaster OTK potential is probably somewhere in the low A tier. It has a decent matchup against everything else, and it has insane kill potential. Plus, it's pretty resilient to things like Royal Oppression, unlike most other combo decks, because you have triple Lila, double Honest, and double Raikou, as well as Trunade, Heavy Storm, and Typhoon. So you have a full, basically 8, 9 main deck outs, 10 if you count Hamster, to Royal Oppression. And so your OTK combo is going to walk through back row a large percentage of the time. I think it's a very solid list. If you guys want to see me pilot this list, play it against more competent players, definitely check out the members only video on it. Okay, next list. What have we got? We've got Lightsworn. This is a good deck. This is a really, really, really good deck. I think Lightsworn is one of the scarier decks in the format. It's interesting because people like to equate Lightsworn as sort of a newer player deck, a deck that people can kind of just luck sack their way to victory by milling a wolf. But I actually think it's one of the more temperamental decks where if you make a small mistake and you miss on a crucial mill, you will actually throw the game. So I think there's actually a very high skill ceiling to piloting this deck to a level of success that we've seen it have success at, which is tournament top 8s and even tournament victories in some of the major Edison tournaments. The way the deck works, obviously, is you mill monsters. You get free pluses off of Wolf. Milling Necro and Plague is good value. And then JD plus Cold Wave or JD Monster Reincarnation. JD is your late game end board. In this specific list, in this specific list, I am doing the same thing I was doing in the Flamvell list with triple Lila, double bottomless. You want to open with Lila, mill some cards, make it difficult for your opponent to set back row, mill some more cards, and then with 6 mills, you should be set up to take over the game with no matter what your hand is. So I think this deck is very good. I think this deck is very, very, very good. It is prone to bricking a little bit, and it is prone to getting its wings clipped, proverbially speaking. There are a lot of sort of messy situations where you're going second and you normal summon a Lila and it gets bottomless and all of a sudden your hand does nothing. So I think because of the brick potential, it makes it very difficult for me to put this deck in S tier. In terms of power level, it is an S tier deck. In terms of the good hands, it is probably one of the best S tier decks. But overall consistency make this deck a little bit too volatile to place into S tier. It's probably the best A tier deck for that reason alone. It is S tier in terms of the high power level, the high ceiling, but the issue is sometimes you go second, sometimes you aren't able to mill cards, sometimes your mills just don't reward you for your hand, sometimes you mill like 6 spells and you just get varianced out of the game. So I think that this deck, unless it's focused on being a little bit more consistent, which most of the lists aren't, they're focusing a lot more on power, I think it just has to be an A tier deck. Unfortunately, I do think the deck is very good, and I think the good draws definitely lead for it to be on that S tier power level, but I think overall the consistency issues make it a little bit harder for me to put it in S tier. Okay, next deck. Trap Dragons. This is more of the aggro beatdown dragon strategy. This is the list that I won a side event with recently. You can catch the recap video and deck explanation on the channel. It's an amazing deck. Honestly, it's an amazing deck. I think this is probably one of the best decks, one of the top decks in Edison format. You have a free win in Future Fusion. If you activate this, you just win the game. You have triple Kawaki Mera Drago. This card is insane. It locks up all the top decks. In my opinion, all of the top decks in the format are lighter dark decks, and most of the decks that aren't lighter dark decks do have lighter dark monsters that they really want to special summon, like Gores and Battle Fader. So Kawaki Mera Drago is just an insane card. It is probably one of the best normal summons in the entire format, if not the best normal summon in the entire format, because of its stat line and because of its ability. On top of that, you get to play pre-errata Red Eyes Darkness Metal. This is no longer hard once per turn or anything. You can do it as many times as you want. Red Eyes Darkness Metal is absolutely broken in this deck. It lets you just free pluses. It lets you amass board presence. There we go. Lets you amass board presence. Lets you play into your opponent's sweepers thanks to the Starlight Road and whatnot. Lets you bring out busted boss monsters like White Knight or reuse your Dragos late into the game. I think that this deck is like a very easy S tier deck for me. It's a very, very, very easy S tier deck for me. I probably wouldn't have put it S tier before we started playing DD Warrior Lady in it. It probably would have been an A tier deck. But since we innovated and added the DD Warrior Ladies to the deck, it shores up almost all of the issues that the deck had before. I think that this deck is arguably better than the Telekinetic deck because of the matchup spread. I think it is not as inherently powerful as the Telekinetic deck in terms of like individual card quality, because you don't get to play stuff like Dark Arm Dragon or Mind Control or Emergency Teleport or Dark Grepher, like really powerful cards to their fullest potential. But in terms of like actual matchup spread, just having Drago against some of the top decks and just invalidating their entire strategy makes it very, very, very easy to just like steal wins against, against zombies, against Telekinetic, against Lightsworn. Even the Flamvell deck has issues dealing with the Drago because they do play a lot of light and dark synchro monsters like Colossal Fighter, Thought Ruler, Archfiend, that kind of thing. So you can see its potential. It does have some weak matchups. I think some of the weak matchups you need to account for are the Ancient Gear deck. That's why I have the system down and the 2 Cyber Dragons in the sideboard. Machine decks can definitely give this trouble because they're not lighter dark monsters. But against the Hallmark lighter dark monsters, I mean, this deck just does a great job. Okay, next deck. What do we got? X-Sabers. So this is Pro Storm and my sort of take on X-Sabers. The sideboard is cursed. I don't think we were siding 3 Saber Hole. I don't remember if we were siding 3 Saber Hole. I don't remember building this deck. I'm going to be real. But this is the deck that I played most recently, the X-Saber deck that I played most recently, and this list looks... The main deck looks correct. I mean, triple rat so you can find cat consistently seems good without having to spend your normal summon. So you can have a turn where your opponent attacks a rat, you grab cat, you normal summon an X-Saber, you cat into 2 Airbellums, and then you can special fall troll. Or you can do other variations of that combo. I think this deck's great. I think it's fantastic. I think the biggest issue with X-Sabers is the matchup spread. I think against the other top tier decks, it really struggles. It really, really struggles. Power level wise, it's definitely there. The combos are crazy. When the deck starts comboing, I mean, it looks like the best deck in the format. But matchup spread wise, and like just the pieces of interaction that are getting played in this format, like for example, like the Dark Arm deck, or not the Dark Arm deck, the Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon deck. They play, what is that card? DD Warrior Lady. DD Warrior Lady is insane against this deck. Royal Oppression's insane against this deck. We'll get into it in a second, but Icarus Attack is insane against this deck. Flamvell Firedog eats these guys for breakfast. Lightsworn cards, Lila is great against the deck. Aaron, insane against the deck. The zombie cards, they Book of Life your monster in the graveyard, and then all of a sudden you're suffering. They Bryonic OTK you, and then your battle recruiters are looking kind of sad. So I think I'm going to have to put X-Sabers in... It's a tentative B tier. It might be C tier. It has no results also, which makes it just difficult to place it higher than B tier. But yeah, it's one of those decks where like it is on par in terms of like power level with the combos with like the top decks in the format. Like zombies, when they're synchroing, their synchro combos are actually just worse than the synchro combos in X-Saber. But your opening plays in zombie are better. Your opening plays in telekinetic are better. You get to play better cards overall. Your card quality is improved. So I think the deck is probably a B tier deck. I'll look at it again in a second once the tier list is more complete. But for now, I'm going to put it in B tier. Okay, next deck. Diva Hero. Diva Hero. So this is a Diva Hero deck that Silchus Ruin took to a top 8 finish in RBET1. And I want to talk about it because in RBET1, we all thought Diva Hero was just the truth. Last year, Diva Hero didn't even exist. It wasn't even a deck that was on anybody's radar. If you go back and watch the early tier list videos, we were just like, maybe there's an Absolute Zero deck? We don't know. We were putting it in like C tier and stuff. Then, out of nowhere, it just like does amazingly in all of the tournaments in 2021 and in the early tournaments in 2022. However, since the first tournament in Edison 2022, the first RBET, the deck kind of fell off. The hate got a little bit too extreme for it, and the brick potential is just too high. The issue is you're drawing multiple divas, which don't do anything. You're drawing multiple malicious, which don't do anything. And your only real starter play is set Snowman Eater, normal summon Stratos, or Evil Guy into Caius. If you draw Evil Guy without Caius, it's kind of rough. If you don't open Stratos, it's kind of rough. And if you don't open Snowman Eater, it's kind of rough. And even if you do open Snowman Eater, it's not the best because it's not a proactive threat. You can't attack with it. You can't pressure with it. You can't poke into Rykos with it. You're just forced to set it. Going second, Snowman Eater is not one of the best openers in the game. So I do think that the deck struggles from having just a little bit of a weaker early game without drawing some of the bomb openers, which would include Stratos, Future Fusion, that kind of thing. So I think the deck is significantly weaker than it used to be. While I do think it is still a good deck, I don't think it is as good as something like Lightsworn or Diva Zombies, which is kind of taking the sort of place in the metagame where Diva Hero used to sit. So I think I'm going to put it in A tier. I'm going to put it above Flamvell based on results alone. It did have a lot of tournament success last year, and you can't really discredit it. And it's also one of the best decks at playing Phoenix Wing Windblast, which is probably the best trap card in the format. So it is a good deck. It is a very good deck, and it's definitely an A-tier deck, and it definitely can kill you and murder you out of nowhere. The good draws are insane. Of course, you're going to see a lot of this, but the consistency issues lead me to place it in the A-tier. Okay, next deck. Next deck. Gladiator Beasts. Gladiator Beasts. I didn't even rank this deck in the last tier video because it was a meme. And then I got a bunch of comments and I was like, dang, I should ignore it again for this tier list video. But no, I'm not going to do that to you guys. I'm not going to do that to you guys two tier lists in a row, okay? I'm not going to ignore all the Gladiator fans 2 tier lists in a row, even though it got me a bunch of comments. But if you do like Gladiators, now you have to comment because I need that engagement, all right? I need that engagement. What do I think about Gladiator Beasts? I think it's a good deck. I think it's legit a good deck. This is how I would build the deck, personally. I like 1 shrink. I like 2 smashing. I think these numbers are strong. I like double bottomless, triple deep prison, double road. I'm a big fan of that configuration. You'll see that in my dragon list as well if you watch that video. I do like this configuration in decks like this that are a little bit normal summon reliant, that are a little bit weaker if your normal summon gets stopped. I do like having a fat stack of defense there. And then, of course, I do like Call of the Haunted in this deck quite a bit. No Torrential is a creative design choice. I think torrentialing your own Gladiator Beast monster and shutting off your own War Chariot is pretty stupid, so that's why I'm not playing it. I do like playing Gores in this deck. Oftentimes, people will go for a crazy push OTK, and then if you just stop it with Gores, it's very easy to come back into the game thanks to the push potential of Gladiator Beast Skyzeris, and just Test Tiger into Murmillo as well. So I think this deck is very good. I think it does a very good job of gatekeeping some of the weaker decks in the format, and it actually has a pretty good matchup spread against some of the top tiers, which I'll get into at the end. I'm going to talk about matchup spread at the end. So I think Gladiator Beast is actually an A tier deck, and I do think right now in the current metagame, it is better than Diva Hero and Flamvell. While it does lose to Diva Hero and Flamvell, I think it is better than them in the overall metagame because of the way it matches up against some of the S tier decks. Again, I'll get into that when the tier list is finished. But for now, let's just move on to the next deck. Okay, next deck. What do we got? Relinquished. So this is one of those decks that I wanted to include on the tier list because I think this deck's fucking insane. Like, I actually think Relinquished decks are crazy. There's been Relinquished Quickdraw variants. There's been Relinquished Frog variants. But basically, I have this list. This is a Relinquished Frog variant. I'm going to show you why I think this deck's crazy. And it's basically this card right here, Preparation of Rites. This card is Pot of Greed later in the game. It's Pot of Greed that summons you a boss monster without spending your normal summon. That's crazy. Yes, the deck is a little bit weak to Royal Oppression, but you can mitigate that. Also, Preparation of Rites makes stuff like playing Raikou in the Quickdraw Relinquished variants very strong, and it also makes, like, just in general, like blind milling with stuff like Card Trooper, that sort of stuff, pretty strong in general. So I'm just repeating myself. My words are not coming out super clear. I think Relinquish is one of the best decks that is not explored at all. And I do hope to see people pushing this in the future. Relinquished is basically this format's Thousand Eyes Restrict, and Thousand Eyes Restrict is banned in this format. So I think Relinquished is pretty fucking solid. I'm gonna put it in B tier over X-Saber, and actually right under the Kuras field spell control deck. The only reason I'm doing it is because it has no results. But I could very, very, very easily see a Relinquished deck move up into the A tier or even the S tier in the future because of how powerful Preparation of Rites is as a card, and this card in general, the Djinn Releaser of Rituals. If you guys play during Necro's format, you understand why this card is not only ban-worthy, but just obscene. Some decks just completely fold to a Relinquished with a Djinn attached. So there's a lot of ways you can make this deck. There's probably a better way than this, but this is the list that I have pulled up. Go ahead and experiment with it. Let me know what you guys think. You get the vibes. Okay, next deck. We got, what do we got? Burn. This is a deck I played in the last Deck Devastators tournament. I think Burn is good. I straight up think it's good. Is it as good as some of the other decks? I don't know. I don't know. People have been experimenting with it a little bit. They've been toying around with different builds, not necessarily this variation. We've seen Chain Burn. We've seen, variations of Stall Burn. We've seen Pac-Man Burn. We've seen a lot of different burn variations kind of like underneath the surface, kind of going under the radar. I think Burn is really good. I think it's really, really good. I think it's very slept on. I'm going to use Injection Fairy Lily as the icon for it. Unfortunately, I scrubbed the fuck out of Deck Devastators, so I can't really put it in a high tier as of right now. But I do think it is about as good or better than the Fish deck. So I'm going to put it in C tier. For now. I think it's definitely got potential to be better than like X-Sabers. Maybe even on par with like the Carpath or Ancient Gear deck. Or even better than the Ancient Gear deck if people are citing a lot of system downs. But I can't honestly put it higher without results. And I did scrub with the deck personally. And it does have some pretty serious weaknesses depending on your build. This build in particular is weak to Deck Devastation Virus, which we'll get into later. Okay, next deck. Next deck is Gemini Hero Beat. Gemini Hero Beat is probably, while being the most boring hero variant to play, it is probably the best hero variant to play in Edison format. I think it's very good. I think it is on par with, if not better than, Gladiator Beasts. So I'm going to put it in the A tier. I think it's a very consistent deck. It does what it's going to do. It does have some bad draws. The bricks are real with this deck. You can either draw one of these 9 cards without a payoff spell. Let's say your Alias gets banished, and then you just draw Dead Sparks and Dead Hero Blasts. That does suck. That does suck. Sometimes Hero Blast isn't very good, especially if your opponent is like summoning a Caius. You're like, okay, my Hero Blast doesn't really do anything. And sometimes you can run out of actual threats because the deck is so monster light. If one of your key monsters, like let's say you summon an Ocean and gets bottomless, all of a sudden your Miracle Fusion is just dead. Like you have 2 waters in the whole deck for 3 Miracle Fusions. Yes, you can tutor for them. Yes, you can get them pretty consistently, but it's pretty difficult in the cases that they do get banished for you to actually win the game if it goes long. So I think this deck does have some significant weaknesses, which make it impossible for me to place it in the A tier, but it does have some pretty big strengths. That being that it's a big back row deck, it does get to play Skill Drain, which is a good card against Monarchs, Quickdraw, those kinds of decks. Lightsworn can struggle with Skill Drain quite a bit. It does get to play Honest, which is one of the best hand traps in the game, if not the best hand trap. Well, not the game, but format. One of the best hand traps in the format. And it does get to play Future Fusion, which is broken. So it has a lot of good stuff. Stratos is obviously very good. Auto +1. You get to play all the cool little stun cards and the fusions as well. But in general, I think it's just a consistent stun deck. It's got the power of Stratos into Alias. It's very fast. It can aggro people out very easily. And Skyscraper lets you get over big monsters, so you don't get walled out as easily. But I do think it's got some consistency issues. And again, that's going to be the differential between A tier and S tier is the consistency issues. Okay, next deck. Next deck we've got is Quickdraw Dandy Warrior, the hallmark of the format. This deck is so based. If you enjoy playing this format at all, this is probably the deck that you enjoy playing this format with. It is probably the most fun deck to play in the format. Drill Warrior is awesome. He basically says you're never drawing a dead card ever again. If you draw a dead card, just pitch it to Drill and then turn it into a live card, whether that be Caius or Raikou or something like Thunder King or Honest, depending on your variation of the build. It could be different here or there. This deck is probably the best deck to utilize Pot of Avarice. This deck is probably the best deck to utilize, of course, Debris Dragon. Well, best or second best, it might be as good in the Karpath Kuras deck as it is in this deck. But this is one of those cool decks where you can tech it out. You can play whatever you want. This list in front of you has a bunch of tech. It's got 2 Thunder King, a Lila, and double Honest. You could easily just cut these 5 cards in the DD Crow and add your own 6 tech cards. The engine is very flexible, lets you play whatever you want to varying degrees, and it's just a very consistent advantage building deck. The issue with this deck, the biggest weakness with Quickdraw is that it's low power level. Most of your combos are just ending you with 1 Synchro Monster, which is fine. Like that's cool, you know? But you can't really do more than that. You don't really get to play an insane boss monster like Dark Arm Dragon, Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. You don't get to play Judgment Dragon. You don't get to go into Bryonic, which is arguably the best synchro in the format. You don't really get to do anything after you debris into Black Rose. You just reset the field and then hope to card advantage your opponent out of the game. The issue is when you don't have those power cards, it's very difficult to compete with opponents who do have those power cards. So a large part of this deck, I would say, is geared towards stopping the power cards. That's why I've included the 2 Thunder Kings. That's to stop the other Haymakers from the opposing decks. We've got the DD Crow to stop the Haymakers from the opposing decks. We've got Gores to reversal the OTK stuff. And then, of course, in the sideboard, we've got Vanity's Fiend and Kaiku to help prevent against those decks, as well as 2 copies of Royal Oppression, which I've been citing for Gladiator Beast decks, which can give this deck quite a problem. So I think overall, this deck it's good. It's kind of low power level. It's very consistent. It's going to do what it's going to do every single game. It's difficult to brick, especially if you're slimming on bricks, like playing 2 Pot of Avarice as opposed to 3, that kind of thing. Maybe some people have been cutting Titanial. I don't agree with that. I think Titanial is fantastic, but some people have been cutting it because it can be a brick in some cases. I do think this deck is better than both Hero Beat and Gladiator Beasts, but I think it's worse than Lightsworn. So I'm going to put it in A tier. I'm going to put it over these 2 decks and below Lightsworn. It's a really good deck. You can tech it out for any metagame, and it's a lot of fun to play. So if you just want to play the format and have a great time, potentially win a tournament here or there, and just consistently do a decently strong thing every single game, this is definitely going to be the deck for you. Okay, next deck. Next deck, we've got brand new list. Another list that I've done a members only video on. This is my personal Gigaplant Twilight Rose Knight combo deck. This is a combo deck that aims to summon Powerful Dragon and pressure the opponent with consistent snatch steals. This is probably one of the best and most scary combo decks to play against. This is the deck that I am the most scared of playing against in the entire format. I have not leaked it thus far until now because it is actually really, really scary. If you have Twilight Rose Knight plus Mystic Tomato or Twilight Rose Knight plus Lone Fire Blossom turn 1, that's a turn 1 Power Tool Dragon, which means you're going to get the Phyrexian Arena effect every single turn unless your opponent can out Power Tool Dragon. This is scary. Twilight Rose Knight is also a card that lends you some nuke potential by going into a quick Black Rose if you need it. It can also help you set up for Dark Arm Dragon and play Allure effectively because it is a dark. It's a warrior. You can search it with Rhoda. It lets you have this DD Warrior Lady as a toolbox option. You can search it off Sangan. You can search it off Tomato. This card is fantastic at providing this deck with a mid-ground synchro play and turn 1 threats. And then on top of that, if you ever do have Lone Fire Supervise, it's an auto-win Splinter Twin combo. It is so disgusting. This deck is probably, for me, oh man. See, I haven't seen anyone else play it yet. And if you guys want to watch this deck and see it in action, then you can become a member and see me play it in the members only video. But from the games that I've played with this deck, it's terrifying. It is probably an S tier deck. It is probably an S tier deck. It's very difficult to interact with. You get to play the best cards. You have the power level with Dark Arm Dragon. You get to play Gores. You get to play Sangan, DD Warrior Lady. You have consistent level 7 synchros. You have speed, which is something a lot of other decks don't really have. You have turn 1 boss monster plays, which a lot of decks don't have. You have basically answer this or I win scenarios, which is pretty much every time you summon Power Tool Dragon. You can make this format's version of an unbreakable board, which if I remember correctly, it's Power Tool, Supervised, Gigaplants, and Titanial. I think that's this deck's unbreakable board. I talk about it in the members only video, but basically there's no 2 cards in the format that can break the board, which is insane. And then it basically guarantees that you can rebuild the exact same board on the follow-up turn as well. So this is a terrifying deck, and I've held off leaking it as long as possible. But for the new tier list and for everything else moving forward, I think it's important to talk about this deck. It's scary. It's legitimately scary. The only reason it might not be an S tier deck is because it does have some bricks. It's got 1 Copy Plant, it's got 1 Titanial, it's got 1 Gigaplant. And then, of course, the Mark of the Rose and the Supervised can brick if you don't have a plant to go along with it. There are a large number of plants in this deck, so it's very difficult to actually brick on Mark of the Rose. But sometimes it's possible to brick on Supervise or brick on Copy Plant, Gigaplant, and Titanial. So it might end up dropping down to A tier, but I do think it is a better deck than Lightsworn. It is more consistent, it is quicker, it is better at applying serious pressure, and the late game is just absolutely insane. Having 3 copies of Snatch Steal is unfair. It's just super unfair. Your opponent can't even play the game. If you ever get to like a middle or late game situation with this deck, Mark of the Rose just wins the game. It's very difficult to beat that card. Okay, next deck I want to talk about is Vayu Turbo. This deck has a lot of the results, honestly. This deck has topped a lot of tournaments, and I can see why. It's pretty consistent. You've got Triple Raikou to help pop back row. You've got Royal Oppression to help deal with uninteractive combos, very special summon heavy combos. And then, of course, you've got the powerful Dark Greffers and Armageddon Knights to set up for the Vayu Beatdown combo, which makes your deck very, very fast and very, very threatening. I think this deck overall is an S tier deck. I think it's better than Diva Zombies and probably on par with the Telekinetic Powerwell deck. I think these Greffer Armageddon Knight decks are very strong, and I think that they're decks you definitely need to be prepared for when entering in this tournament, or not in this tournament, in this format, in tournaments in this format, because it's just so consistent. You're going to see exactly what you want to see every single game. You have multiple accesses to all of your power cards in Plague, Necro, Vayu, Sirocco, that kind of thing, Elfin. You can go into really strong monsters, and then you have Royal Oppression to back it all up. This is one of the scariest decks in the format. Also, you get to play Deck Devastation Virus, and this is a card I've been kind of holding off on talking about. Deck Devastation Virus bodies a lot of these decks down here, below it. It makes it very difficult for those decks to play. And it's part of the reason why I actually think the Telekinetic deck is better than the Diva Zombie deck. If you get deck dev'd in the Diva Zombie deck, you kind of get owned. Your Divas get owned, and then you can't really make your play. If you get deck dev in the Telekinetic deck, it's fine. They discard your Krebins, you power well it back, and you're pretty happy with that, all things considered. So I think that deck dev is the reason why I have the Telekinetic deck higher. It is another reason why I have the Dragon deck high, because I think the Dragon deck does actually very well against this deck specifically. You don't normally mind Royal Oppression as much because you can Totem Dragon and then distribute summon a huge monster, which outclasses all of their stuff. You don't necessarily mind the value stuff in the grave or the plague stuff in the grave or Dark Armed because you have Drago to lock these cards out. So you're the one who's presenting the threats as the Dragon deck, and I think since you have a very good matchup against this deck, and this deck has a very good matchup against a lot of these decks down here, like X-Sabers, for example, or like Fish and Burn, for example. Because you have a good matchup against the deck that has the good matchups, it makes you a serious meta contender is basically what I'm getting at. Okay, overall, very good deck. Definitely an S tier deck. Okay, moving on. Next deck. What do we got? Frog Monarchs. This is a cool deck. I'm liking a lot of the innovations we've seen lately in tournament lists with regards to the Synchron monsters being added to this deck. We've seen Junk Synchron have a lot of tournament success. We haven't seen Quickdraw Synchron have a lot of tournament success, but I have one copy in this list, and I think it's pretty good, all things considered. This deck is cool. It gets to play Battle Fader, it gets to play Gore's Trag. Battle Fader is one of those cards that's like strangely good in the format, but only really good when you have ways to convert off it, and this deck has plenty of ways to do that in 8 Tribute Monsters and Substitute as well. You get to maximize on Soul Exchange, which is all in all a broken card. Oh, I should say 9 Tribute Monsters. I forgot about Jinzo. The deck does get to play Dark Arm Dragon, which is one of the upsides. It gets to play Allure of Darkness, so you do have some powerful late game threats. And then you have a Junk Synchron Infinite with Swap Frog, which is actually quite nasty. Sideboard, you get to play triple Vanity's Fiend and a lot of cards to help interact with the unfair stuff. I think this deck's pretty solid. I think the biggest issue with this deck is that it's incredibly linear, and unless you draw specifically Dark Arm Dragon, you're very normal summon reliant. So if your normal summon gets stopped, you kind of just lose, and you're kind of weak to OTK potential from decks that can either summon Vanity's Fiend or summon Kwakimare and Drago. So the Dragon decks and the Vayu decks, when they're summoning Vanity's Fiend, or decks that can summon Fossil Dyna, for example, like Hero Beat, can give this deck a really, really hard time. I think this deck right now is better than Diva Hero, but only just. It's kind of in the same camp. I think it's like slightly better than Diva Hero, slightly better than Flamvell, but worse than Glads in the metagame right now. Another reason why I think Glads is pretty good right now is it actually has a good matchup against these Vayu decks, and it has a good matchup against the deck Devastation decks. So that's why I have it so highly here, as well as the Hero Beat deck. The Quickdraw deck does get bodied by deck Devastation Virus, but I think Quickdraw, you can build it in a way that it doesn't, because you can tech the deck out completely. So a lot of this whole situation, and that's another argument for maybe the Lone Fire deck being a little bit worse. The only issue, or not issue, but the only upside to the Lone Fire deck is if you get deck dev'd, well, at least your Mark of the Roses are live. So you can like triple Mark of the Rose, and then if they hit a Dandelion, you at least get 2 tokens, and you can maybe tribute summon your Gigaplant or tribute summon your Titanial and go from there. Or Mark of the Rose, their best card, and sort of figure things out from that position. Where was I going with all this? Next deck? Frog Monarchs. Oh yeah, Frog Monarchs, it is a little bit weaker to deck dev. You do have a lot of cards that are sub 1500, and if you get hit with it turn 1 and you don't have access to Treeborn Frog, your deck kind of falls apart. That's another thing too, is you have a lot of cards in this Frog engine. You have minimum 10 cards in the Frog engine, and those cards just don't really do anything on their own. Like, they can amass a little bit of advantage if you have the Treeborn Frog loop with Swap Frog. You can build your own Sinister Serpent. But outside of that, like, you're just kind of setting up 2 dupes and hoping your opponent doesn't pick up resources in the meantime that can kill you. So I think it's a little bit underpowered into some of the power decks, even though you do get to play Dark Arm Dragon. And that's why I have it kind of low on the A tier. It might even fall to B tier depending on how the meta shapes up. It's a good deck. But it's not like... It's not the best deck. And it's pretty easy to pick holes in the strategy if you have stuff like Pulling the Rug or Mask of Restrict or whatnot, so... Yeah, okay, last few decks. We're almost to the end of this tier list. We've got Evil Hero. This is a deck designed by Huni. I think it's Who Needs Meta. Who Needs Meta? Is it Who Needs Meta? Is that who? I think it's Who Needs Meta. Yeah, I think it's Zytalos. The name is Zytalos. Whatever their YouTube channel is, I'll leave it in the comments below. But this deck is sick. This is basically a fusion combo deck that's aiming to abuse Dark Calling and Miracle Fusion with triple Emergency Call to get access to your whole engine. This deck is so sick. It has so many different synergies. Prisma gets you access to basically anything in the whole deck. You can send a Fiend for Dark Gaia. You can send a Rock in Grammel or Big Piece Golem for Dark Gaia. You can send a water monster in Ocean for absolute 0. You can send all sorts of different stuff. Cyber Dragon for Chimera Tech. So this is like the premier purple card deck in the format, and I think this deck is sweet. I think it's a little bit more resilient, a little bit more powerful than the Diva Hero decks, because you're not super duper reliant on not drawing your bricks, basically. Every card you can draw in this deck is more or less a decent card to draw, since Dark Calling can fusion summon from hand, worst case scenario. So you're not really as brick heavy with Gilmans and Maliciouses. Well, you have this Malicious, which can be a brick. And you do get to play the same sort of triple Caius Evil Guy sort of package, which gives you a very strong start going second. I think this deck is actually better than majority of the decks we've mentioned. I'm going to put this at a tentative S tier, tentative top tier. I think it is a little bit better or on par with the Gigaplant deck that I showed. And I think it's a little bit better and a little bit more consistent than Lightsworn, while still having a lot of the same power. Summoning absolute 0 is actually insane in this format. It's like one of the best things you can do. And this is a deck that does that while bricking as little as possible. So I think that this is the best absolute 0 deck as of right now. And I think it has a lot of OTK potential because of the Dark Callings, because of like just the speed of the deck with Evil Guy and Nikias. And I think it's just one of those scary decks that it's hard to face. It's very hard to face. They can kill you out of nowhere, and there's not much you can do about it a lot of the time. Most decks can't really interact with this very favorably. Even Drago is actually not the best against this deck because Evil Hero Dark Guy is an Earth for some fucking reason. Yeah, so this deck is, it's scary. This is a scary deck. I definitely would consider this if I was going to go to a tournament as one of the decks that I personally would play. So definitely a deck to check out. And shout outs to Zytelos from, I think it's Who Needs Meta, is the name of their channel. I'm having a serious brain lapse here. I'm going to feel like an idiot later because I watch their videos like all the time. So I'm having a serious, like, next deck. Let's just get into the next deck. Okay, what do we got next? Dragon Glurbo. This is like the all-in combo version of the Trap Dragon deck. I think this deck is bad, personally, but the ceiling is the highest of anything in the format. Basically, when you go off with this deck, nothing can beat you, because you have Drago to stop Gores, whatever, and then you have Vortex plus Trunade to clear whatever. So when you do go off, you can't actually lose. You win the game guaranteed through everything in the format that isn't specifically Herald of Orange Light, which we'll get into, don't worry. That being said, that is when you go off. And the deck bricks on the lower side of 30% of the time. So 1 out of 3 games you're losing. That's not good. That's not good. Legit. While it is an unbeatable combo, it's just not happening 1/3 of the time. And you don't really get to choose that 1/3 of the time. You don't really get to choose if you brick 3 times in a row and then win 2 matches. Or you brick 4 times in a row and then you're out of the tournament. So because that can happen, I gotta put it in B tier. That consistency issue is really what's holding it back from being an S tier deck. On power level, it's the most powerful deck in the format, or second most powerful deck in the format in terms of power level. In terms of actual consistency, it's probably down there, with your brick draws just do absolutely nothing. They just don't do anything, and you're just going to get run over by any draw from any deck in any tier if you break with this deck. So it's got to be a B tier deck for me. It's a good deck. And it's a scary deck, and you do have to be prepared for it, because if you have interaction and they have a good draw, sometimes one Thunder King is all it takes to stop their good draw and turn it into a brick. Sometimes that's all it takes. So you do have to be prepared for this deck. It is going to show up at tournaments. It does have tournament success because it is kind of one of those, when it runs hot decks. But yeah, that's where I'm going to have to put it. I think it's just too much of a gamble to bring it when there are just more consistent decks that can do their thing more consistently and still be at a decent power level. Okay, next deck. Next deck I got to talk about is the new Swedish Blackwing list. This is a terrifying deck. This deck is ungodly, it's unholy. This is a list that won the most recent Edison major tournament. Let me go ahead and pull up my little graphic for it here. I made a special graphic for this one. This is a list that J4 and Theodor have been playing. They are both Swedish players. They're both ungodly good duelists with insane records against top players. and insane tournament records. This list recently won the last tournament, going 12-1. This is a very, very scary list. Okay, let's talk about it a little bit. You've got the speed in spell and trap removal in Heavy Storm, Space Typhoon, and Nobleman. You've got the speed of the Vayu Turbo deck with Dark Grepher, Vayu, Dark Grepher, Sirocco. You've got the speed of the Blackwing deck with Black Whirlwind, Shura, and then you've got the late game, mid game push of Blizzy plus Dark Armed, as well as double Dark Eruption to guarantee your graveyard is clear for your Dark Armed and to reuse your power cards like Kalut and Gale. Kalut is like one of the best hand traps in the format. It's top 3. And Gale is just fucking insane card. It helps you get over anything that might get in your way. Bora the Spear provides you a lot of pierce potential, a lot of push mid-late game. This deck is the definition of hyper offense. You're actually pretty trap light. Only 7 traps, 6 of which affect the board. So you're pretty trap light in this deck. You have very low defense. You're just hoping that your high monster quality and your turbo aggression is enough to get you through the game, and then you only really need to resolve 1 trap card to sort of cement the W, basically. This deck is scary as fuck. It is probably the best or second best deck in Edison format right now. It is the most played deck in Edison format right now, and there are ways to combat it, which I'll get into in a second. One of the best ways is, of course, play the Dragon deck. The Dragon deck destroys this deck. It says your aggression is cute, but I'm just gonna, summon a Drago, and then all of a sudden half your deck does nothing. And then I'm gonna set a trap card, and all of a sudden half your deck does nothing. The issue is you get into these gambling situations where if they have specifically like Nobleman plus this sort of stuff, or they have like Gale, Sirocco, they can attack over your Drago if you don't have the right pieces of defense. But in those in those situations, the Dragon deck also has DD Warrior Lady, which helps you, stabilize against some of these cards. DD Warrior Lady is one of the best cards against Shura. It's one of the best cards against Blizzy. And then, of course, this deck is a little bit kind of sus against other decks that play like Stratos, because a lot of your openers are actually weaker than 1800. So you can get kind of like your aggression stunted by Stratos decks. So it's not by any means an unbeatable deck. And it does have some like questionable matchups, which is going to be the last deck I talk about here in a second. But it is a very good deck, and it's a very scary deck. If you're playing Edison format in a traditional fashion, like if you're playing like an old school Gladiator Beasts list from 2010, decks like this are going to pop up and they're going to shove your shit in. Like you're basically not going to be able to compete with something like this if you're playing an old school sort of list. If you're playing an up-to-date list, you can probably compete with this. And if you're playing a deck that just has a good matchup like Dragons, or the next deck I'm going to talk about, or honestly, Lightsworn. I think Lightsworn does very, very, very well against the Swedish Blackwing list in particular, specifically because this deck is very defensive light and it's heavy-handed on back row removal. Lightsworn doesn't often play a lot of back row, and then on top of that, they get to do more broken shit if your opponent has no back row. Lightsworn's field day when your opponent is no back row, or an Icarus attack, or something that just like interacts awkwardly with a summon Lila, basically. This deck is not interacting favorably with Lightsworn in game 1 at all. It's going to turn into a sort of race with that sort of deck, and because they have Honest, because they can play cards like DD Warrior Lady, because they can play cards like Tragors, even Fader, or like just get an early Wolf or Judgment Dragon, which outclasses all of the monsters in the deck without Kalut, it can be one of those kind of tense matchups for this deck. I think it's not one of your favorite matchups. And then post board, they have access to Consecrated Light, which, as you can see, completely shuts this deck off for the most part. They really have no outs to it outside of specifically Icarus attack, or like set monster, flip monsters, try to synchro summon, and that's just assuming your opponent has nothing else going on. So Lightsworn does kind of have a field day against this deck. There are some decks that can build to have a field day against it. I think the Quickdraw decks can build to have a field day against it. That's why the list I showed had 2 Thunder King and 2 Honest. I think those cards are very good against the Swedish Blackwing deck in general. The Telekinetic deck is actually pretty fucking good against it, because normal summon Krebon stops a lot of what this deck is trying to do. It kind of forces them to go into Bryonic to out it. But other than that, very scary deck. Definitely a top S tier contender, and it definitely has the results to back it up. And then the last deck I want to talk about in today's tier list is Fairies. And I've said it a million times, and I'm going to say it again. This is probably the best deck in Edison format. I mean, the more I play it, the more I see good players picking it up and playing it, and like having success like in smaller tournaments, having success in some of the major tournaments. It is just such an insane deck. I have built this tier list assuming that everyone is playing perfectly. Yes, that's not always the case. Yes, this deck is very punishing if you make small errors. Yes, this deck can be pretty mean to you, but man, this deck's crazy. You get to play the best hand traps in the format, which is Honest and Herald of Orange Light. You get to play the best on-board traps that are monsters in Thunder King Ryo and DD Warrior Lady and Christia. And then on top of that, you just have a very hyper-consistent engine where you're seeing exactly what you want to see every single game, thanks to your tutors in Shining Angel and Nova Summoner. And then late game, you get to play the best bomb in the format, which is Return from the Different Dimension. This deck basically gets to play all the best cards. It basically gets to play them to their fullest potential. Your boss monster, your JD, your Dark Arm Dragon locks your opponent out from coming back. So once you stick your Christia, the game ends. Usually, opponent can't come back from it because they can't special summon their Bryonic to out it. That's the issue with all the other boss monsters in the format, is if you drop them and it's not lethal, your opponent can just reversal you with their boss monster. This deck is the only deck that has an exception to that, because when you drop Christia, your opponent can't come back. And if you have Herald of Orange Light to back it up, it's so hard. This deck's biggest strength is that it can set up layered interaction against all of the unfair decks, and then against the fair decks, you just pick them apart with DD Warrior Lady and Thunder King. So against the unfair decks, if you have, like, let's say a Bottomless and a Thunder King and a Herald, you have 3 different layers of interaction that they have to fight through, and not one of those layers of interaction can be outed by one specific card. So not 2 of those interactions can be outed by one specific card. Sure, they can have Trap Dust Shoot for the Herald. Sure, they can have like Lightning Vortex for your Thunder King. Sure, they can have Heavy Storm for your back row or whatever, but they have to have all 3 of those to even play the game. And that's why this deck is so punishing and so disgusting against most of the decks in the meta. The biggest weakness this deck has is, of course, Deck Devastation Virus and Light Imprisoning Mirror. But you can build your sideboard kind of like I have here with 6 cards to come in that are very powerful against Deck Dev decks that also aren't hit by Deck Dev or Light Imprisoning Mirror. And you can just bring those in over 6 cards that get hit by Deck Dev and then just immediately have a decent matchup and blank most of their Deck Dev pushes where they're getting 2 for 2, but it's not really hurting you that badly. And then, of course, you could even go deeper into that. You don't really need to side the Crows or the Second Oppression in a Swedish Blackwing meta. You don't really need to be siding, pulling the rug if you don't expect a lot of Monarchs, and you can just add more monsters that get around not only Light Imprisoning Mirror, but Deck Devastation Virus as well, and then just swap them in for the post-board situation and just win that way. This is one of the best decks in the format, if not the best deck in the format. I would highly recommend it to players who are serious about competing in this format. I think the top 3 or top 4 for me are these 4 right here. I think everything below it is just there. Probably the 5th best deck is the Vayu Turbo deck. I think the only issue with the Vayu Turbo deck is it's kind of doing what the Swedish Blackwing deck is doing, but like significantly worse. Because instead of Whirlwind, you have Raiko Caius, which is like, it's more fair, but it's less broken and it's less aggressive. It's more like slow and grindy. And you're going to get out advantaged by decks like Glad and Quickdraw and sometimes even Lightsworn if you try to play a slow and grindy matchup against them. It's just not going to work out as well. That's why I think the hyper-aggressive Swedish version is just a better deck. I think the top 4 decks right now for me are the Telekinetic deck, the Dragon deck, the Swedish deck, and the Fairy deck in any order. If you're going to pick up a deck and you want to be serious about competing in this, I'd probably pick anything in the S or the A tier. Any of these decks can win a tournament. Anything below this could maybe spike a tournament, but you'd have to get pretty lucky in your bracket. And I'm not even going to rate any of the other decks in the format as of right now because I think these are just the contenders you need to be considered with, or considered of. These are the contenders you need to consider, basically. If you guys want to compete with the top level Edison players, in the Discord below, or in the description below, there's a Discord, really big Edison Discord. That's where all the best players are congregating. That's where all the biggest tournaments are being ran. If you guys want to, of course, support the channel, like, become a member, subscribe, that kind of stuff. This is going to wrap up the tier list. Hopefully you guys found this informative. Hopefully you guys found this helpful. And I'll see you guys in the next vid. Peace.